Welcome back to another edition of Detonation. Today we have actually three guests, but two are here with us. It's a very special show because we're talking about something we all don't want to be talking about because of its disastrous impacts on Australia and the economy and our jobs and of human lives. We're talking about the Murray-Darling. We're going to talk about the Snowy Hydro and the Bradfield scheme. Today, in no particular order, we have Topher Field. He's an optimist, a libertarian, a filmmaker, unapologetic believer in personal liberty and personal responsibility. He's a fantastic communicator. Go check out that YouTube channel. Go check it out. It's absolutely, and it's not a fake thing because you've been doing it for a long time. You've been producing really good stuff for a long time, and you're a long-time advocate of water policy, and you're a Murray-Darling Basin thinker. Thank you, Topher Field, for coming on the show. Just quickly introduce yourself.
Mate, it is absolutely my pleasure. Anyone that does want to have a look at my work, you're actually better off having a look at the Facebook page these days. I do a lot of content that isn't video anymore, so facebook.com/Topher Field. But thank you for the introduction, and it's wonderful to finally get the sense that there is some progress happening on water issues. But as you say, I started in, if my memory serves me correctly, 2009 was my very first video on water issues, and to be honest, most of the issues that I started highlighting all the way back then still haven't been fixed.
Absolutely. Another guest we have on the show is Mr. Ron Pike. He's a writer at Quadrant, a speaker, he's a builder, he's a political force, he's a water expert, he's a major right-wing political influencer and player, he's an advocate for national issues in Australia. Some of his recent titles are A New Song of the Darling, How the Murray Went Up the Creek, Who Is Really Killing the Darling, and Drought or Water, Plain or Plenty. Mr. Ron Pike, it's such an honor to have you on the show. I've seen your speeches, I've seen you going around the country, and you've been doing wonderful things for the nation, so thank you very much for coming on. Just to introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you, Steele, and hello, everyone. I'm really just an old bushie from the back of Barellan, but I've spent the whole of my life working on, relaxing on, and enjoying the rivers of the Murray-Darling Basin. My knowledge of the basin is simply an accident of the life I have lived there. But for the last 50 years, I've been a very, very vocal advocate for better water policy, and particularly for the fact that we have not invested in water infrastructure now for well over 40 years. And during that time, our population has nearly doubled. You add to that the fact that we've given our stored water away to green bureaucracies and speculators. That is why we're all here tonight. We now have a critical shortage of water for the people.
The third person that he isn't here right now because it's in the United States and it's 3 a.m., but he wanted to come on the show, so he actually wrote us a statement, which I'll read out now, is Fraser Renning. And Fraser Renning, for me, the reason I was talking to him about this is because I remember in his maiden speech, he said, during his maiden speech, first and foremost, my priority is water. That's what he said. And I think that's a very valid statement. So I'll read out his statement. He would have been on the show, and he said if this ever happens again, that he's more than happy to come on the show. So that's fantastic. But he said in the statement here, I strongly support the Bradfield and other schemes to get water to the inland of Australia, and I have done so for 50 years. We need to drought-proof the barren inland and turn it into the food bowl of the world. We have ample water in our major rivers that is completely being wasted by running out to sea. We have lived in any other country, including third world countries, we would have utilized this water by now. We just need politicians with some vision beyond their paycheck that could make this become a reality. I would just like to get your reaction to that because I know Topher, for example, you're big on the six-figure salaries in Canberra. What do you think? Beyond the paycheck, is that truth?
Sadly, yes, I think it is. And in fact, it actually goes a lot deeper than that. There are some very serious questions being asked at the moment by some very serious people, the likes of Mick Keelty, the former Federal Police Commissioner. He's now the Northern Basin Commissioner for the northern half of the Murray-Darling Basin. His job, think of him as the cop on the beat. He's there to make sure that everyone's complying with their responsibilities, no one's taking more water than they're supposed to, and so forth. He has raised some very real and very serious concerns, and coming from a former Federal Police Commissioner, you have to take it seriously, about undeclared conflicts of interest and the potential for insider trading amongst both politicians and high-level bureaucrats who may have been profiteering off the changes in water price using inside information because they know in advance what legislation is being put forward and so forth, and they can potentially, if they decided they wanted to, they could potentially profit from that. So I think it goes now far beyond my contempt for how much they get paid for how little value they bring, but actually to the point now where in this particular issue, there are some really serious questions that need to be answered. Maybe no one's done anything wrong, but we certainly need to have an investigation that clears people's names, or for those that have profiteered at the expense of the rest of Australia, we need to know who they are and they need to be dealt with appropriately. So it goes even well beyond that now.
And Ron Pike, you fundamentally agree with the statement?
I certainly agree with everything that Fraser Anning has said there. And just going back to what Christopher has just said, I don't think that's the major issue here. The major issue is that the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, the federal legislation that allowed it to happen, was never ever necessary in the first place. And the great big fault that was made was when Malcolm Turnbull convinced the states that they had to disassociate water licences with land that could be irrigated. Once that was done, or first of all, until that was done, a licence to irrigate had to be attached to land that could be irrigated, which if you stop and think about it, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Once it was, that nexus was broken, any entity anywhere in the world, and particularly bureaucracies, could buy water licenses and do with them as they saw fit. So what we have now, rather than our stored water in the dams that we built for that purpose, effectively being there for next year's irrigation crops and for the supply of stock and domestic and municipal use, that water is now owned by speculators, profiteers, and green bureaucracies. And this gets back to what Christopher was referring to. It's allowed the creation of what I call water barons that do control very large quantities of water, and they are becoming very, very wealthy out of control of that water. But it is denying the use of that water to the people that grow our food. And we are sitting here today only 3 to 6 weeks away from the first plantings of what is traditionally our food crops, our summer crops. There is no allocation of water for annual crops anywhere in the Murray-Darling Basin right now other than in South Australia. So by Christmas time, unless Mother Nature does something dramatic in the next 6 weeks, we will be A, importing our food, B, we're going to have 2 million people who've seen the whole of their future destroyed, and it's being destroyed for no practical reason whatsoever.
Can I just pick up on what you said at the start there, because I agree there was no reason for the Basin Plan in the first place. And this is a really important point that people need to understand. There is this rhetoric that the Murray River is dying, that the ecosystem is dying. Now that's emotive language. An ecosystem can't die. Individual elements of a system can die. And so you need to be able to measure and say, what are the metrics by which you're saying this system is dying? Well, I went through some of that in my video in 2011, back when the plan was just a draft. It was just a proposed plan. They hadn't implemented it yet. And they listed a couple of key things. Rising salinity levels was one of the key metrics they said was proof we needed to have this plan. Reductions in biodiversity, reductions in fish stock, and one other that escapes me just at the minute. I went through each of those systematically in that video and proved that each of them was demonstrably false. If I take the example of rising salinity levels, salinity had been a problem, a growing problem into the 70s and into the early 80s, and then landholders, because it's bad for farmers as well. What a lot of people don't realize is an unhealthy environment is very bad for farmers. Landholders and farmers, as well as councils, recognised that rising salinity was a problem, and by the time the Murray-Darling Basin Plan was proposed, salinity levels had dropped by over 90% from their peak. About a decade and a half before. So yes, there had been problems, but they actually, if you go through them systematically, they had all been recognised and they were all in the process of being addressed already. But what we saw was opportunism, because what they said was there in 2006, I think it was, when Malcolm Turnbull first kind of put it forward and the Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, was very much on board the journey of this, saying the system is dying. Well, we were at that point, we were 6 or so years into the worst drought of living memory, and that drought persisted until 2010, when we actually had the wettest year in recorded history. And so it was an opportunity for them to say, well, the river is dying. Well, yes, of course it is. It's a drought. We're in the middle of a drought. But what was lost was the perspective that without the dams and the weirs and all of the man-made infrastructure, the Murray by that point in time would have been a trickle, if that. The Murray has actually dried out, and we have records, we have photographs of a dry Murray River. And that would have been the fate of the river in 2006, 2007, through to nearly 2010, had we not been there with our dams and weirs actually improving the health of the river relative to what it would have been had it been left to nature. And that point gets missed.
Yes,
absolutely correct. I can't add to that. That's a great summary. Spot on.
So the reason I brought you guys together was because I think we don't have this fundamental discussion, this great discussion around when you listen to the discussion, you hear a lot of Sydney University people. Literally, that's who it is. It's all Sydney University, and what some tactic that I find that they use is, if they want something done, they throw in the word Indigenous, and then bang, everyone falls over. It's a tactic. I've noticed some very silly policies, and they use the word Indigenous, and bang, it all collapses. But what shook me, and we'll use it as a springboard to find out all the other issues, was the Minindindi fish kills. And I know that there was a blue-green algae problem because of low oxygen and not enough flow out and all this sorts of stuff. But that was, for me, because it was a national event, everybody sort of went, whoa, what's going on with the Murray? Why is there so many fish dying? And then I started to look into it. I started to investigate it. And then I realized that, and Topher's been bringing out some stuff on this, but farmers are killing themselves. They're going bankrupt. They're deep in debt. Small towns and communities are disappearing. There's untold misery, the unproductive land, the misuse of resources. It's supposed to be the food bowl of Australia. We're supposed to be an agricultural superpower, and we're not even a domestic supplier. We're importing food. There's mismanagement. There's corruption. That's got a question mark around it, because there's different layers of corruption. It's Australia's largest river system, which is a really important topic. And towns and rural communities across the basin rely on a healthy river system, and that impacts our economy, our food security, and our well-being. So how did you two get onto this? Is it some of these issues? Is it broader issues? What encouraged you to start unraveling some of these dark elements, which are just starting to come to light?
Look, I started this discussion very shortly after John Howard appointed Malcolm Turnbull to the office of Minister for Environment and Water. I had a meeting with Malcolm Turnbull, and at that stage he was determined to take over control of the Murray-Darling Basin. That meeting actually took place right here where I'm sitting now, in my home in Coffs Harbour. We proceeded to have a acrimonious discussion where he tried to convince me that he knew all about the Murray-Darling Basin, and he absolutely knew nothing. And I have been fighting ever since, because I knew very, very well that if the Commonwealth succeeded in circumventing Section 100 of the Constitution and taking control of the water, that would be the end of our food bowl. It was inevitable. There was no other reason for them to do it. And I don't want to go into the politics of what's behind that from a United Nations point of view, but the excuse that they have to take water back for the environment, which they never ever even determine what the environment is or where it lives or where it belongs, is simply a front for destroying irrigated agriculture in the Murray-Darling Basin. And that is why I have been so vocal. It's why I have got involved in politics at the highest level to try and stop this, because we are now at the most critical stage where, if this whole plan is not completely overturned sometime in the next few months, 2 million people are going to see their livelihood disappear. And don't think that 2 million people is as far as it goes. They're the ones that are directly affected. As I said at the beginning, or said some time ago, unless Mother Nature intervenes in the next 5 or 6 weeks and gives us a flood, there will be no planting of annual crops outside of South Australia in the whole Murray-Darling Basin this year. Now, when you stop and consider that that's where our food comes from, not just for Australia, but so much that we export, that is a disaster. And we are weeks away from that happening.
Yeah, Ron, you make some great points, and I've actually been just making notes because I want to pick up on a few of the different things that you said. Just very briefly, my own sort of journey into the issue. I made my very first video that I'd ever made during the Millennium Drought, and Melbourne was on what were called Stage 3A water restrictions, and I was a bit annoyed because even just the existence of Stage 3A water restrictions was a political thing. I won't go into it, but they didn't want to go to Stage 4 because it would make them look bad. So they invented this new stage halfway in between 3 and 4, and just all the nonsense that goes on, right? And this was the beginning of me discovering a lot of these things. And I guess my transition from being someone who, in my past and certainly into my teenage years, broadly trusted government and thought that government was there for the best, and if there was a government program to do something, well, that was probably a good thing because there was a real problem and that was going to get fixed by the government program. And I guess this was around about the time I began to grow up and realize, well, actually that's just not how it works, and their intentions may, and they aren't always, but their intentions may be good, but the result very rarely is when the government gets involved in something. So I made a video actually to do with the desalination plant that we were building down here in Melbourne. And in my opinion, we should have been building a dam on the Mitchell River. So I made that video, vented my spleen on the subject, stuck it on YouTube, on a brand new YouTube channel that had 0 subscribers. And that was that. I'd kind of got it off my chest. Somehow people got a hold of it. People started watching it. It started to do the rounds. I don't actually really know how that worked. I don't know who it was that found it. Then after a little while, Andrew Bolt put it up on his blog, and all of a sudden the views started to go up into the thousands. And I'm sitting here going, "What in the world is this? 1,000 views seemed like a really big deal." And then this is the weird bit: the phone started ringing, and I started getting emails. And to this day, I do not know how people got a hold of my phone number or my email address, but people presumably just got my name and then went looking for me. And I had people asking me, "Oh, can you do a video on this issue or that issue?" The most memorable one was someone was very upset that the government, the local council down in Frankston was putting in a set of traffic lights in a particular intersection when they felt it should have been a roundabout. Okay. Now put yourself in my shoes. I'm driving a forklift for a living in a refrigerated warehouse. I'm just a young single guy who's made one video to vent my spleen over one particular issue, and I'm getting phone calls from people saying, "Please come and be the voice of the roundabout versus traffic light in Frankston debate." It was all very, very weird and very surreal. But then eventually someone came along and actually put something in front of me and said, "Hey, are you aware of this?" And her name was Jan Beer, and she put in front of us information to do with the North-South pipeline, which was a pipeline proposed to bring water from the irrigation districts in the north of Victoria down to Melbourne for us to use as drinking water. And as I looked at it, I went, well, this is one of the dumbest ideas I've ever seen. And it's just wrong and bad from so many different directions. And what really galled me and got me started really was the lies that were actually built into that. Everything that the politicians were saying about this pipeline. For just as one example, they said it was going to be a 2-way pipeline. Well, the pipeline started in the Goulburn River, went up over a mountain range and then down into Melbourne. They only had pumps at the Goulburn River end. How's it a 2-way pipeline? And even if they were to install pumps at the Melbourne end so that it does become a 2-way pipeline, the design was that it was actually narrower. The diameter actually shrank as it went down the mountain, because obviously the water's going to flow faster and faster, so you can have the same volume in a smaller diameter. It was clearly built and designed from the get-go to be a 1-way pipe. But all of the publicity, and even in Hansard, in Parliament, they're standing up and saying this is a 2-way pipeline. This will be able to be used to send Melbourne's water back up to the irrigation districts in years where Melbourne has too much. It was a lie. And that's what really began to fire me up. So I did that video. I did a third video on bringing water from Tasmania to the mainland of Australia. It sounds absolutely insane. Actually, you know what? I think it might be a decent idea. We should build a dam on the Mitchell River first, because that's an even better idea, but it's not the worst idea you've ever heard. Then my fourth video was called Liars, Damn Liars and Politicians, because I had it with the amount of lies and misinformation that I was seeing. I'm looking at the time there was the Northern Victorian infrastructure, something or other, renewal program or something. They were spending a whole bunch of money on water management infrastructure in the north of Victoria. And in Hansard, in Parliament, the water minister at the time had stood up and said, this is going to be the amount of savings, the amount of water savings. This is what these efficiency upgrades are going to get for us. But in his own documents from his own department, they actually said that the entire amount of water flowing through the system was lower than the amount of water he was saying was going to be saved. So it's a physical impossibility. And just things like this, and they were getting away with it. No politician was picking them up. No one was spotting this stuff and calling them out on the front page of the newspaper, which is where it belonged. So anyway, I made that video. Each time I made a video, I kind of went, well, that's it. I've done my bit, thrown that out there into the ether, and I'll just get back to being a forklift driver. And then someone always came back to me and said, well, hang on, what about this? So then someone came and said, well, hang on, do you know about the MDBA? And I said, the what? You know, I was a city kid. I not quite born, but bred in Melbourne, and hadn't really looked outside of Melbourne up to this point. I mean, I've travelled outside of Melbourne, but in terms of looking at water issues and these sorts of things, no, not at all. So they began to put some things in front of me, including, Ron, some of your material was in amongst what was put in front of me right back then. And I read that and went, well, that north-south pipeline, the bringing irrigation water from Goulburn to Melbourne, is no longer the dumbest idea that I've ever seen. I've found a dumber one. It's called the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and their basin plan. And so I then went ahead and did what was my 5th video, which tragically has proven to be very much accurate in its predictions of the absolute havoc that would be caused by the Murray-Darling Basin plan if they implemented it. And unfortunately, of course, they did, as we know, and we're still here to this day. That was 2011 I made that video, and here we are in 2019, living with the consequences that were oh so obvious. And people like Ron were documenting in meticulous detail what those consequences would be. And people like me were taking the work of Ron and others and compiling that and making videos and trying to get it out there and raise awareness and get people to realize what was coming. And unfortunately, despite our best efforts, here we are, this much later.
There's been so much misinformation, and it goes back to very, very basic things. And I did a radio broadcast on this some 2 or 3 months ago. It gets back to a lot of people in Australia, and I'm sure most of the politicians still believe that we are a very dry continent. We haven't got enough water. The water we have got is not where we want it, blah, blah, blah. All of those things are wrong. Australia has more water per head of population than any other country on earth. There's 290 million megalitres of water flows off the mainland in average every year, of which we use less than 3 million megalitres. And guess where most of that water flows off? Between Adelaide and Cairns. Where do most of the people live? Between Adelaide and Cairns, for goodness sake. The rest of it flows to the west side, which is what we're talking about here, which is our food bowl, the Murray-Darling Basin. And what have these clowns in Canberra done? They've handed the water that we do have in storage, and don't think it's just the basin, I'll get onto this in a minute. They've handed that over to green bureaucrats and said you can flush it out to the sea, regardless of the damage you do on the way and regardless of the need that people have for the stored water. But the New South Wales authorities also withdrew from farmers a minimum of 15% of their initially allocated water rights, and they gave that to a green bureaucracy in Macquarie Street. And those people also flush that water out of our system every year for no worthwhile reason whatsoever.
It's the same in Victoria. We do the same.
We haven't just not built any more storage while our population has doubled, but we've taken the water that we do have in storage and flushed it out to sea. So is it any wonder that here we are, we're not even really in a decent drought yet. In fact, from central New South Wales to the bottom side of Victoria is actually having a very good season. But there's hardly any water left in any dams. The Snowy scheme's down to 1 million megalitres, a quarter of its capacity, and it'll run out of water if it doesn't rain by Christmas. We are in a desperate situation, all caused by Malcolm Turnbull, breaking the nexus between a license to irrigate and land that can be irrigated. We must never lose sight of the fact that that is the key to the whole equation, and it's the key to fixing it.
So I just want to give some brief facts on the basin area before, and then we're going to go on with the MDBA, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. It's a bit of a hard acronym, but the basin area covers more than 1 million square kilometres, which is equal to 14% of the mainland Australia. The basin includes 75% of New South Wales, so obviously it gives New South Wales a huge say in what happens. More than 50% of Victoria, 15% of Queensland, 8% of South Australia, all of the ACT. The basin area is the 20th largest river catchment in the world. Australia's 3 longest rivers are in there, the Darling, the Barwon and the Murray. Much of the northern basin, 800 is 900 kilometres wide, from the Great Dividing Range in the East Plains to beyond the Darling River in western Queensland and New South Wales. The length of the basin is also almost 1,400 kilometres long, from the source of the Warrego River in Queensland, south, and the headquarters of the Goulburn River in Victoria. So more than 2.6 million Australians live and call the Murray-Darling Basin area home. 3 million people have access to fresh water from it. The basin is the food bowl of the nation. Agricultural industry is about $24 billion annually. It's a unique wildlife area, indigenous purposes. Farming runs through all the regions with 9,200 irrigated agricultural areas. There's a lot more factors, but let's go on, because I just want to go on to the history. Where Topher and Ron, I'll let Topher move in on this first, but then Ron go in after this. Where do you see the current disaster having its roots?
I think it has its roots in a point that Ron made a minute ago. The inability to actually define what is the environment. We have a lot of people who define themselves as environmentalists, and they want to believe that they're more aware and that they're more evolved or what have you, because they care about the environment. But it's incredibly difficult to define what that is. And let me just give you a couple of quick examples of how that influences the practical thinking in how you manage water inside a water basin. For example, right now, our farmers, when they get their water released from a dam for them to then extract and then use on their land, any losses in the conveyance are lost to the farmer. So if they have, let's say, 100 megalitres coming downstream for them, but the authority or the managing body says, well, you're going to lose 20% of that in conveyance losses or 30% of that in conveyance losses. Now that's water that might have evaporated, or the bulk of it goes down into groundwater. It simply seeps out of the river system or seeps out of the canals. And that loss at the moment is being borne by the irrigators themselves. So they pay for 100 megalitres of water, but they only actually get, say, 70, 80, however many it might be, depending on where they are. That loss is actually going into the environment. Replenishing groundwater is one of the key environmental objectives of the MDBA. And yet, this water that's being lost into groundwater is not being counted as environmental water at all. So here we have a double standard of, well, our environmental objective is this, but the water that goes there isn't environmental, because we have this really fuzzy thinking about what the environment is. There's a lot of hate being thrown at open channels, open channel irrigation. I believe there's over 6,000 kilometres of open channels through the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, it might actually be more, I might have the wrong number there. But people assume that, oh, these are terribly inefficient because water evaporates and water seeps into the earth and is lost to groundwater. And because of that, we should be running pipes and pumps instead of open channels fed by gravity. What they fail to realise is that these open channels are actually habitat. What we have is 6,000 additional kilometres of river that the environment is making wonderful use of. As soon as the irrigation season starts and these channels start to fill up, we see birds, you hear frogs. It's almost like they come out of nowhere. I don't know exactly, I haven't investigated it, but I assume the eggs must sit dormant until they hit water or something, because they just seem to appear out of nowhere. Migrating birds, the Menindee Lakes, have, even before human intervention, they were somewhat inconsistent. They would fill up in a flood and they might have water for 2 years and then they'd dry out, and they might be dry for a few years and they'd fill up again. The migrating birds, but there are birds, when the Menindee Lakes have water in them, that literally come from the other side of the planet to come and breed there. And then when it's dry, they go and breed somewhere else. And then when we fill them up again, they seem to find the place again within not very long. Life finds water and finds a way. And all of this water, all this infrastructure that we've created is actually creating a beautiful life-filled habitat, a beautiful environment. But it's not seen that way by the regulators. they look at it and say, well, if we've changed it, then it's no longer natural, it's no longer the environment. And so no matter how good it may be, no matter how much bird life or fish life or whatever else it may be supporting, it has to be viewed as inferior to the stuff that we haven't changed. And so therefore they turn around and say, well, just before we got here, the water used to just go down the river and go out to sea. So what are we going to do to restore the environment? We're going to mimic that. We're going to send the water down the river and it'll go out to sea. And they think in their mind that they're doing the environment a favor, because to actually use what we've done to create more life is not the objective for them. It's to mimic what would have happened if we hadn't been here. And to me, I think that's the underlying flaw that has caused all of this.
Christopher, following on from that, in one of my presentations, and I say this as someone who was a rice grower for a very large part of my life, and as you know, I've certainly lived in the irrigation areas all of my working life. I have never ever spoken to a fish, a frog, a tadpole, a duck or a pelican that asked me, is this a man-made or a natural wetland? But the ones I have spoken to have told me they actually prefer the man-made ones because they're more permanent. I can give you that straight from the duck's bill. I want to take you back to some research that was done by the University of Canberra. It's about, crikey, it's 12, 13 years ago now. They spent 3 summers in the Riverina investigating the growth in rice paddies, and they were particularly interested in frogs. At the end of that research operation, they came to the conclusion that something in excess of 5 billion, that's 5,000 million frogs, bred in the rice paddies of the Riverina every year. They extrapolated that to the fact that it was the biggest frog breeding area in Australia. Mm-hmm. Now, frogs are only in the middle of the aquatic food chain. It starts off with little midges and yabbies and fish and ends up with wading birds. What's this plan done? We used to produce 1.5 million tonnes of paddy rice a year. Last year, we produced 59,000 tonnes. Next year, unless something happens in the next 6 weeks, we are going to produce 0 tonnes of rice. This plan is destroying the Australian food bowl. It is destroying the livelihood of over 2 million people. It is destroying environmental assets, and it will send Australia broke.
And that is something that is just, that's a great example. The frogs are using the rice paddies to breed. As far as they're concerned, it's just a wetland. You know, they don't see the difference. They don't notice that it's rice growing there. It's a wetland and they can breed. But that example is played out over issue after issue. The list of environmental harm being done by this plan is actually long and growing, to the point that I note that just the other day, the Greens senator from South Australia, where the lower lakes, the Murray actually exits Australia within her area where she was elected as a senator, Sarah Hanson-Young, she actually made the statement. She called for a royal commission, which she's been doing for a while, but she made what I think is a really important statement, especially coming from her, and that is that this issue is no longer about the environment versus farmers. She's recognised that that's no longer what this actually is, and her language used to embody that environment versus farmers. There was some sort of a trade-off, and she's recognising and she's realising now actually there's a lot of overlap here. Most farmers are environmentalists. Most farmers, if they're worth their salt and if they care about their profitability in the medium to long term, are going to be looking after the physical environment, the health of the environment on their land and around their land. And so she said, this is no longer one versus the other. This is actually the big end of town screwing the rest of us, screwing the environment and the farmers for their own individual benefit. So yeah, this idea that the environment is somehow separate, the idea that water can only be used either by the environment or by farmers is completely wrong. If you use it for the environment, then yes, it can't be used by farmers. It's not going to do any actual production of anything useful to humans. If it's used by farmers, it actually does both.
Ron, you wrote... sorry, Ron.
Can I just...
yeah, you go. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
You're right.
Christopher, I know you appreciate this, but it's not quite what you said. They assume that if you punch water down the Murray, it's going to the undeclared, undescribed, unlocated environment. It's not.
No.
It's not.
No.
In fact, it's putting water down where we already have water and it doesn't really need any more. And what it's doing, it's taking water away from the wider environment.
Yes, agreed. Agreed.
The idea that some water is environmental and some water isn't, and this leads me up to something else I want to cover. All water has advantages for the environment. The thing that we have to not lose track of, the only water we have is what falls from the sky by way of precipitation, whether it's rain or sleet or snow or hail or whatever it might be. Depending on where it falls, approximately 94% of it soaks into the ground or evaporates. There's only 6% that flows down their drainage systems. Forget about calling them rivers for a moment, they're drainage systems. And that's the water that mankind can use. But the other point I want to make, and I made this in the parliamentary inquiry in New South Wales a few years ago, because people, they get hot under the collar about evaporation, and Christopher mentioned it earlier about channels. There is no more important link in the chain of life than evaporation. The amount of water we have on Earth in total is exactly the same today as it was 10 years ago, 100 years ago, or 10,000 years ago. And evaporation is part of that cycle. And the great thing about evaporation is it doesn't matter whether the water is highly saline or dirty or filthy or whatever. In the process of evaporation and returning it, it comes back as near pure water. There is nothing to be feared by evaporation. And the reason that the rainfall has actually increased across southern Australia in particular in the last 150 years is because we have more water to evaporate, because we've built dams and weirs and invested in irrigated agriculture. There's someone who was, I hate to admit how old I am and how long I've been around, but it is well known by people of my generation and my father's generation that when the irrigation areas of the Murrumbidgee Valley were developed, the areas that were wheat sheep farms, particularly to the east, over a period of a couple of decades, the rainfall in those areas to the east increased, and it increased simply because of the increased evaporation further west. The same thing happened at Collyamberley, where I started my farming life, and areas to the east of Collyamberley that were quite marginal are now very profitable winter crop growing areas because the rainfall's increased. And it's simply because evaporation off the plain, as it goes east, it hits the foothills of the Great Divide, it rises up and it comes down as precipitation.
So it sounds like you want to talk about the great 2007 heist, the Commonwealth heist. So I'll jump to something that Ron wrote. He wrote, "The founding fathers of our nation saw the supply of water so fundamental that they enshrined the people's right to this resource in Section 100 of the Constitution, which states that the Commonwealth shall not, by any law or regulation of trade or commerce, abridge the right of a state or the residents therein to the reasonable use of waters of the rivers for the conservation and irrigation." So the basic story is that the Commonwealth doesn't have legal authority over water rights and access to water rights as a resource. But then post 2006 drought, 2007, when John Howard brought in the Water Act, talk about the Water Act. Talk about how they took it over, and was that a good or bad thing? Because that was the birth of the MDBA, right?
Look, the Federal Water Act, I've said, and I put this in print it will go down in history, in my opinion, as the biggest mistake that the federal parliament has ever made. And for Turnbull in particular to use the Ramsar International Agreement as a cover for doing it and circumventing Section 100. Now, what should happen, the Minister for Water in New South Wales, and believe me, the last 1, 2, 3, 4 of them now, I've had meetings with them and said, look, this is what you should do. Ring up the Prime Minister tomorrow and say New South Wales is withdrawing from the Murray-Darling Basin Plan for the simple reason it's unconstitutional and we're not having a bar of it. Mm-hmm. And if they had the guts to do that, but because of, party politics, they don't. If they had the guts to do that, that would be the end of the plan. It'd be all over. And that's what should happen. But, watch this space. I've got a meeting with the Minister coming up in a couple of weeks' time. So we'll have another go.
Let me drill down a little bit further into what you've just said there, Ron. Professor John Briscoe, I think, certainly articulated, in my opinion, in writing, one of the most digestible accounts of this fraud that I've personally seen, not to take anything away from your work, Ron. But the way he articulated it was the federal government wanted to take over the management of the Murray-Darling Basin for its own reasons, some of them fair, some of them foul, in my opinion. But for whatever reasons, it wanted to do that, but it couldn't because of Section 100. But there is now in legal precedent, there is this idea that, and it's nonsense for reasons that I'll go through in a moment, but there is this idea enshrined in legal precedent that international treaties somehow trump our constitution. This kind of idea that because it's international, somehow now it sits above our own national constitution. Well, that doesn't work because the signatory to the international treaty is our government, who are only given powers under the Constitution and therefore only have those powers to begin with. They can't delegate to somebody else powers they don't have. So I don't care how many nations have signed up to it. It was still our government that did it, and they are still bound by the Constitution. However, what Turnbull recognised was that if the government was going to take over control of water, they needed to do an end run around Section 100 of the Constitution. And he realised that the Ramsar, the International Agreement on the Preservation of Wetlands, was his ticket to be able to do that little manoeuvre. By saying, well, hang on, the lower lakes and the Coorong, they're Ramsar listed. And this plan is all about delivering water down to the end of the Murray River and keeping those lakes nice and healthy as our obligations under the Ramsar agreement require us to do. He then said, well, see, Section 100 no longer applies. This isn't about that. He's wrong. He's completely wrong. And that will eventually get undone and will be recognised as the fraud that it is. But actually, that little piece of cleverness on his part is actually going to bite them in the bum very soon. Because what that actually means is that they are inescapably tied to the lower lakes. The lower lakes, they cannot distance themselves from that. And that's poison for reasons that I'm sure we'll get to shortly in this interview. But the CEO of the MDBA, whose name escapes me, was recently in a radio interview on 2GB. And he was at pains to tell the interviewer, Andy somebody, that the MDBA is so much more than just the lower lakes. It's not just about the lower lakes. He was at pains to be distancing the MDBA from the lower lakes. And he's manoeuvring, he's preparing because he can see what's coming. But the MDBA is inextricably tied to the lower lakes because their only veneer of legitimacy is via the Ramsar agreements, which is on the lower lakes. And the moment they lose that, which they will in only a few months' time, their ability or the constitutional question will then become completely unavoidable.
I agree.
Okay, yeah, so how else as the MDBA, like, because obviously Topher, you worry about the flows, and Ron, you talk about how there's no water there. So how else has the MDBA destroyed the basin? Why is it that having a 95% outflow to stop dredging, why is that an important issue? Why does the government think that that's important?
Look, it's not the government, it's the bureaucrats in Canberra, the 400 odd of them. But it gets back to this. The only reason those fish died, and the only reason we're short of water now, is because not just the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, but the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the state water authorities have stopped using our dams for storage for use further down the river in dry times, and they've flushed the water out of the dams. Now, there's nothing quite so useless as an empty dam in a dry river. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about the environment or the people or the kangaroos and the emus. That's what we have now. Currently, we have 3 of the biggest wetlands in New South Wales absolutely bone dry. They are the Menindee Lakes, the Kiwar Dam and the Burrendong Dam. The Burrendong Dam's still got about 4% in it. I was up there the other day, but it'll be dry very, very shortly. We have the Darling River, the Warrego River, the Namoy River, the Castlereagh River, the Barwon River, all bone dry. There's no water. It was a little bit of water in one spot in the Darling. The Macquarie River will be dry before Christmas, once again, with the proviso, unless Mother Nature intervenes. This has all happened just because of these multiple bureaucracies. It's not just the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. If you look at the Darling River, do you know how many separate water authorities there are managing the water, in inverted commas, what used to be water?
Managing, yeah.
Managing. There's 11 of them. There's 11. Now, the Darling River, if you look up some of my work, and I can't remember the exact figures, but prior to the building of the dams, the first of which was Keep It on the headwaters of the upper reaches of the Darling catchment, the Darling River used to run dry on a recurring basis. I think it ran dry between 1880 and 1960, about 30 something times. So this idea that it used to be a magnificent river, forget all of that.
No.
That's not right. Once we built Keep It Dam, and then shortly after we built Burrendong, Split Rock, and a couple of other smaller ones, the Darling River not only didn't run dry for that 40 years, but we developed large areas of world-class irrigated agriculture, all of which happens to be pristine environmental habitat, as Mr. Burris pointed out. But since we brought in this plan, we've not only got the Darling River dry, we've got no irrigated cropping, and we've got towns out of water. Now, who would have thought that in 2019, in what is supposed to be a first world country, we've got whole towns that haven't got drinking water. Now, the government should hang its head in absolute disgrace that they've allowed this to happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to this, and one of the things that anyone who's not familiar with the Murray-Darling Basin just kind of needs to internalise is just how big the place is. And that the problems affecting one area or one particular river might be quite different to the problems affecting another. We literally have droughts in one part and we don't have any floods right now, but there have been times when there's droughts in one part of the basin and literally a flood moving its way down the river in a different part of the basin. It's the size of France and Germany combined. So if you think about how in the south of France, how different the weather's going to be from the north of Germany, well, that it can literally be like that in the Murray-Darling Basin because it is physically, it's 1 million square kilometres. It's roughly the same size. So what we have then is quite a challenge of management. But I would say in approximately the 80s, not long after they finished building what turns out to be the last dams that we've built, not that they knew that at the time, but that's the way things have worked out. In the 80s, I think we had a period of relatively good water management throughout this area. It was being done by agreement between the states. Yes, there were problems, but they were being recognised and being addressed. And we had a situation where farmers could make their plans based on, okay, there's a certain amount of water in the dam right now, so I can predict with some accuracy what my allocation is likely to be next year, and I can make guesstimates around, am I going to plant a winter crop this year or am I not? And they could make, because they've got to plan 18 months ahead in order to actually be able to be efficient and be effective at growing food and staying in business. And they were able to do that. The big change that came in with the 2007 legislation, in addition to what Ron has already talked about, separating the water right from the land onto which that water was supposed to be delivered, the big change then was that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority was given $13 billion for the express purpose of taking money away from irrigators and returning it to the environment. Now, we've talked a lot about returning it to the environment. We haven't really talked about the lower lakes yet. I'm sure we'll get there. But I want to leave that point aside for a moment and talk about the significance of reducing the consumptive pool, the amount of water available to the farmers. They did that in two ways. They did that sometimes just by buying water licenses. They just came in and said, right, because now it's a tradable commodity, we're just going to buy that one off the market because someone's willing to sell it. And instead of a farmer using that to put on their land and grow crops, we're going to send it down the river to do whatever we claim that water is going to do. What that does is not only remove that farming family from their community, but it means there's fewer kids going to the local school, there's fewer people using the local businesses, etc. And so it starts to actually, just the sheer amount of money being spent on these water licenses, number one, the price of water went through the roof because there was this artificial demand from a body that had no business case. There was no threshold at which they said, well, that water price doesn't make sense for us. No water price made sense for them. They weren't doing it to make money the way that farmers did. They were just buying it to be able to meet a KPI and tick a box and say, yes, we've spent all that money and we've bought all that water. So they just push the price of water way, way higher through this artificial government or taxpayer-funded demand. At the same time, as Ron has already talked about, the speculators were able to enter the market, and there's been a whole bunch of, that's a whole rotten egg in itself. So all of a sudden, farmers are sitting there saying, well, I can't actually afford to buy any water, even though, the ones that are trying to stay in business, that are trying to stay on the land, they haven't sold out of whatever water right they have. If they need additional water, which generally farms these days, most of them, they have a certain amount of water right that they own, so they get an allocation every year against that water right. That usually doesn't cover all of their water needs, especially if the allocation is low. So then they have to go out to the market and buy what's called temporary water or one-off water, where they just get that water delivered and they use that to grow grass for their milking cows or to grow a winter crop or whatever it may be. They can't afford to now buy that temporary water, because I interviewed a number of farmers in the most recent video series that I did, sitting there saying, if I have to pay $650 per megalitre of water to grow food for my milking cows, I'm literally staying in business for the purpose of going backwards. They're spending $300,000 on water to produce $100,000 worth of milk. But because of all of the overheads, all the money they've already put in, literally in many cases millions of dollars putting in, whether it's pivots for irrigation or sheds for cows or automated dairies or all sorts of things, they're in this absolutely impossible catch-22. And a lot of them just lose hope and a lot of them walk off the land. That's the happy ending for some, because there are people who make an even worse choice than that. That's the consequence, not of the drought. It's the consequence of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority being given $13 billion worth of taxpayers' money to go and take water out of the consumptive pool, driving the prices through the roof, and then they're just sending that water out to sea. The absolute heartbreak, I think, is here are these farmers who are looking into the river, and the river is running at capacity. The river is actually there's significant environmental damage being done right now because the rivers are fuller than they should be for longer than they should be. And imagine being the farmer where you're going broke, you're going bankrupt, you might be a third or fourth generation farmer. Your whole identity is wrapped up in this land and this place that your ancestors came and settled and made something out of. And you're watching this water flowing down the river while you're signing bankruptcy, going into bankruptcy proceedings. It's almost like a form of psychological torture, in my view. What these people are being put through is, well, it's un-Australian, and that's being nice.
Christopher, you have a very, very passionate and thorough understanding of what's happening. For a forklift driver, you make a very good point.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
What Christopher's just said, as a now retired farmer, it's absolutely correct. And it makes me weep. My grandfather was one of the first 100 settlers to settle on the MIA in 1912. His family are still there, but they're like everybody else. They can't survive. I was the first farmer to use water from the Snowy Scheme in Colliambly in 1960. And I was back at Colliambly only a couple of weeks ago. And all of those farmers at Colliambly know that unless something happens, they won't survive next year. They they've got overheads, they've got families to feed, they've got kids to educate. With no water, they can't grow any crops. And if they can't grow crops, they've got no income and they can't survive. And it's as simple as that.
Topher, didn't you mention in your videos that the farmers are still being charged for water regardless of whether or not they use the water?
Correct.
Yeah, so this is an extra little detail, and I don't want to get too technical, but at the same time, to really understand just how perverse this whole thing is, you kind of do have to get a little bit into the weeds. So when they separated the water right from the title, that was the right to the water itself. So think of that as almost the right to the airspace in the dam. That's actually kind of what you held as a landowner with a water right. You almost held airspace in a dam. And if the dam was 50% full, then you would get 50% of your water right, okay? Or if it's 100% full, I'm simplifying, but that's in principle, if you can think of it that way, that kind of works. But what they did when they separated the right to water away from the land, there was no longer a nexus between the two, but they still had to maintain the canals and the delivery system to get the water from the dam onto someone's property, and that costs money, right? So they left with the farmers this thing called a delivery share. So all the farmers on a given delivery system, on a given canal system, they share in the cost of the maintenance of that system, and they share in the cost of the maintenance of the dams further upstream and so forth. And so the landowners, if they want to get water delivered, have to own a delivery share, and a delivery share might cost them $20,000, $50,000, $60,000, I've heard of $100,000 and more dollars a year. That's what they have to pay just to maintain the canal system that can deliver water. Then, if they actually want to get any water delivered, they also have to pay for that. So you have this really perverse situation where you've got farmers that can't afford to buy any water because it's too expensive and it's uneconomic. They still have to find $50,000 or $100,000 to pay for a delivery share for access to a canal system that they can't afford to use. And
so it's a tax. It's a nice way to say a tax.
Well, yeah, I mean, it functions as a de facto tax against a particular class of people. I mean, it is a legitimate cost. It does genuinely cost money to maintain that system. But to be forcing people who are not getting any water delivered and have had their opportunity to get that water taken away, just made uneconomic by the government's own actions, and still say, well, you still have to pay that fee, you still have to pay that charge. Again, it's a psychological torture, the absurdity of that, to sit there as a farmer and say, well, I'm going bankrupt because of the water access charges on water that I'm not accessing.
Okay, so for while you're...
It's even worse than that. In New South Wales, when the government exacted 15% of the farmers' water licence that was given to them or issued to them by the government, now they didn't pay for it, they exacted it. They just said, we're taking that. That was in the middle of the drought. They said that when the drought's over, we'll more than likely give it back to you. It's never been given back. But listen to this. The 15% that the government now has that water placed in the hands of one of the bureaucracies called the Department of Environment and Heritage, I think it is. Would you believe they're also charging farmers for that water? Now that's extortion. I tried to get a legal firm to take that up because it comes to hundreds of millions of dollars that's been extorted from farmers for a service that the government took away. But this is what's happening in our totalitarian state of New South Wales at the moment. And as I said, I've got a meeting coming up with the Water Minister shortly, and yeah, there'll be some fairly heavy words said about that.
We wish you all the best. Ron, while you're talking, can you lead us into the charge on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and their ambitions into the lower lakes?
Oh, look, the lower lakes, as Christopher knows, is a very vexed question if you want to make it complex, and certainly they make it complex, but it's very, very simple. The lower lakes, First of all, and this is very important, and I was pleased in the last video I saw of Christopher's, he mentioned this, the mouth of the Murray River is at Wellington, exactly the same place it's been for the last 10,000 years or more. There's plenty of rivers around the world that terminate when they enter a lake or an estuary, and so the idea that the mouth of the Murray is somewhere out on the coast is false. The people of South Australia some years ago, back in the 1930s, because those lakes used to go from nearly fresh to quite saline, depending on how much flow was coming down the Murray, they decided to build those barrages and turn the lakes into freshwater lakes. They did that reasonably successfully, and people used to pump out of those lakes and use it for stock and domestic, but also for some crop growing and for dairying. And that's been going on for 60 odd years. Come the drought, and water authorities quite correctly said we're not going to send sufficient water down the Murray to keep the lakes fresh and filled. In fact, they actually bulldozed a bank across the Murray at Wellington in 2007. The lakes evaporated, and they were largely empty for a while, and there were all sorts of problems. Following that, the South Australian government built 2 pipelines, one down either side of the lakes to supply fresh water, and they're in use at the moment. But the Murray-Darling Basin Authority have used as an excuse for flushing water down there 2 things. A, to keep those lakes fresh water. And if you look at Lake Albert, it wouldn't matter how much water you sent down the Murray River, it's not going to make its way into Lake Albert, and it's always going to, as a result of evaporation, become saline. And I have a plan to fix that very, very easily. You could fix it in 3 weeks. But then they said, we have to keep the Murray mouth open. Now, I went down and looked at the Murray mouth in about 2006, and here was this gigantic dredge costing millions of dollars a week, pumping sand out. And I said, why are we doing that? Oh, we've got to have the mouth open because that's how the water gets into the Coorong. And as an old irrigation farmer, I said, well, I've never seen water flow uphill yet. And you might think the Coorong's flat, which it is, but there's a thing called surface friction, and it's 120 kilometres long. And the only way you could put water from the mouth, the so-called mouth of the Murray, to the other end, you'd have to lift the water level about 20 metres. But ever since then, they've been trying to keep the Murray mouth open. Now, as far as the environment's concerned, that beast again, or anything that matters, it doesn't matter a tinker's cuss whether the Murray mouth is open or not, or the estuary mouth, I should say. If Mother Nature puts some sand in there and closes it for 6 weeks or 6 months, it doesn't alter one single thing. But what are we doing? We're spending money on dredging. We're wasting millions and millions of megalitres of water because the Murray-Darling Basin Authority have decided they need to keep the mouth open. They don't. They don't. It wouldn't matter if it closed up tomorrow.
Let me give you this analogy. I'm from Melbourne. We have Port Phillip Bay, all right, 60 odd kilometres across and quite a large body of water, but it comes to quite a narrow mouth. We have to dredge all the time, not so much to keep the mouth open. It does get enough tidal flow in the case of Port Phillip Bay to keep it open, but to keep a channel deep enough for the commercial shipping and so forth, we're dredging there all the time. Now, imagine at some point in time, someone has this harebrained idea to build a barrage across the mouth of Port Phillip Bay. Okay, and let's say we go ahead and do that. And then we expect the Yarra River to supply enough water to keep this vast evaporation pool fresh. Okay, now if we had an epic flood down the Yarra, which it does get some decent rainfall from time to time, it's nowhere near the Murray River, but if we had an epic flood, then perhaps you hypothetically, let's just for the sake of the argument, pretend that we actually managed to push out all the salt water over the top of that barrage, and we now had a freshwater Port Phillip Bay. Okay, and then you sit there and you say, now we expect the Yarra River to be able to supply enough water to keep it that way, despite the fact that billions of litres of water are going to evaporate off that body of water every single year, despite the fact that we actually need to have enough water to flow over the barrages and push water out in order to maintain the health of it. Now, fast forward 80 years from that decision, and imagine that there are people who weren't alive back then who have cherry-picked data to their own liking and cherry-picked anecdotes from the past, and they're now arguing that Port Phillip Bay was always fresh. It was never saline in its history. It's been fresh for 7,000 years, they say.
Yeah.
That is high farce. It is impossible to imagine someone being that dumb. And yet, swap Port Phillip Bay for Lake Alexandrina, and that is precisely the chain of events. You do not have to change anything else in that. That is exactly what has happened with Lake Alexandrina. They are trying to pass off what has been estuary, what has been an estuarial environment for at least 7,000 years, according to the best science, peer-reviewed science that we have available to us. They're trying to pass that off as having always been fresh, as if we're going to fall for that when they built the barrages only 80 years ago. And we have a lot of historical evidence from the early explorers who travelled there. We have knowledge from the local Aboriginal tribes that lived there prior to European settlement. We have photographs of saltwater fish being pulled out by the tons from inside Lake Alexandrina. And we have scientific knowledge from samples that they're able to take from the sediment and determine what used to be here over a long period of time. All of that agrees that this used to be a saltwater environment. One of the reasons why the whole Murray-Darling Basin plan is trying to keep it fresh is because South Australia have cherry-picked one particular study, which has not been peer-reviewed, which came to the conclusion that they wanted, which is it's always been fresh. And they've chosen to rely on that and say, hey, other states in the Murray-Darling Basin, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, you owe us enough water every year to keep Lake Alexandrina fresh, because that's what it's supposed to be. And for reasons that I do not understand, no one told them to go jump, right? No one said, you think I'm an idiot? I'm not an idiot. I know what the science actually says, and I'm going to hold you accountable to what the truth actually is. No one did that. And so we're living in this weird world where all of the state governments and all of their water ministers and the federal government are all pretending that the lower lakes always used to be fresh and that they have to be kept that way, when we know that only 80 years ago, before we put the barrages in, that was an estuary exactly the same way that Port Phillip Bay, exactly the same way that Sydney Harbour is, and you can point to literally 100 estuaries around the periphery of Australia. That's how all of our rivers worked. The Murray River and the lower lakes worked in exactly the same way, but we are literally wasting trillions of litres of water every year trying to pretend that it's supposed to be a freshwater lake.
Absolutely correct. I can't add one word to that. It's spot on.
It sounds crazy.
It is crazy. It is absolutely crazy, and I go back to what I said at the beginning, and I'll keep saying it until it changes. The Federal Water Act and the bastard child it spawned, which is the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, is the biggest mistake that the federal government of Australia has ever made.
Yes.
We've never done anything this stupid before.
While we're talking about mistakes, I need to clear something on the air, so I need to clear this up. So, Ron, you wrote, the media have been plastered with sensationalist stories of water theft, political corruption, plus calls for the closure of Cubby Station and even jailing of cotton growers. Particularly green fingers point at alleged collusion between corporate agriculture and politicians. All of this is being articulated with a loud and noisy passion that fits neatly with the simplistic preconceptions of city dwellers, but it is mostly incorrect. If political optimism could irrigate a field or supply bush towns with the Darling system, would be in flood. When those who promote the policy that caused this problem blame others, as they are now doing in a large part to save their political skins, what we are also seeing is hypocrisy that surges above and beyond all previous high watermarks. Ron, what you're saying that this is the problem, not the cotton growers and the collusion that's going on there. That's all a farce. Can you expand on that?
Yes, I can, and I'm not going to try and go into all the detail because it is complex. Has there been some underhand collusion between authorities and some large irrigators that shouldn't have happened? Possibly. But one thing I can absolutely guarantee you is you've probably seen articles that said, oh, all the cotton growers don't have meters on their pumps and all of that. That is absolute rubbish. Every single pump in New South Wales, regardless of whether it's on a river or a bore or an aquifer or anyone else, has had a regularly inspected meter on it since the 1980s. And I know that because I was in the business. So the chances of any irrigator, whether he be growing cotton or corn or anything else, actually using water or stealing water and the authorities not knowing about it is zero. Because the other thing I want to alert you to is, way back since the 1960s, all of the irrigated areas of the Murray-Darling Basin are photographed from the air. These days it's all done by satellite. And if someone wants to go and water a paddock out the back of beyond somewhere illegally, the authorities in Sydney will know about it within 48 hours. Because it'll show up on the satellite photograph. So the idea that people are blatantly stealing and using water is absolutely incorrect. The Cubby Station is another story, and I don't think we should go into it here except in this summary. With the exception of the water that Cubby Station has access to from the Dirranbandi irrigation scheme, and they are just like any other irrigator, they get an allocation of water if there's high water in the system. All of the water, apart from that piece, which is about 60,000 megalitres, by the way, all of the other water that they harvest never, ever, and never, ever has flows into the Darling River. All of our rivers, or I'll rephrase that, all of the rivers of the Murray-Darling Basin, the westward flowing rivers, once they leave the foothills and they're on the plains, the land slopes away from the river, not towards the river. And if you stop and think about that, this is why. Those plains have been laid down by floods over millions of years. When the big floods come, and they happen every 15, 20 years or so, the bulk of the sediment falls out of the water in close proximity to the river. As the water flows further away, there's less sediment. So, and I know this because I've set up many, many irrigation schemes along all of those rivers. And when you're taking the best example is this. That's why they put a weir in the river, and you wonder why a canal that just needs gravity to flow away from the river. It's because the land flows away from the river. What's that got to do with Cubby Station? Cubby Station's harvested water comes from two rivers that flow out onto the floodplain in the fashion that I've just described. That water never ever flows back into any tributary of the Darling or the Darling itself. It ends up, if it's not harvested and if it's a very big flood, it ends up in the Narran swamps, which are further downstream or further to the west. So the claim that the Darling River's dry because Cubby Station used the water is absolutely false, which is why I wrote that article.
Topher, what about your idea on Cubby Station, political corruption and water theft?
There's a real contrast between the amount of scrutiny that irrigators are subjected to versus the amount of scrutiny that politicians in the MDBA are subjected to. As Ron has just pointed out, there are meters on every pump, there's satellite imagery, there's all sorts of stuff going on to try and catch out the cheats. Have some people cheated? No doubt. There's no doubt in my mind, and in fact, there's prosecutions every year of people who've tried to cheat and been caught. And that's why people like Mick Keelty, the Northern Basin Commissioner, and there may be, I don't actually know about the Southern Basin, that's why they have a job, is to go and look for these people. However, we have in the MDBA a government body that has absolutely no oversight and absolutely no scrutiny, being held accountable by absolutely no one to KPIs that simply don't exist. The contrast between the two could not be more extreme. So forgive me if I tend to gloss over the misdeeds of a small number of irrigators that are being held to account, and I concern myself more with the massive misdeeds of a government body that is spending $13 billion worth of taxpayers' money and not being held to account. That to me seems the bigger issue here. Let me also just add to what Ron just said, not so much about Cubby Station specifically, but about cotton growers more generally. Anyone that says to you that a specific crop is the problem can be immediately dismissed as having absolutely no idea what they're talking about. The irrigation system functions on a system of allocations. If I were growing grapes or growing nuts or growing cotton, I would have the same water to do that with, because that's the water that I have been allocated. So saying that, oh, people shouldn't be growing cotton, okay, they should grow something else with the same amount of water. It has absolutely no impact on the actual amount of water being extracted from the river. Now, if you want to make an argument that there's over extraction, well, you can make that argument and that might have some validity. But to say that a particular crop or how a farmer chooses to use their allocation is the problem is sheer ignorance, and anyone that rests on that claim needs to be just dismissed from the conversation.
So I want to wrap up on the Murray-Darling now. So because I want to shift gears just to two quick comments on the other two topics before we leave. So have either of you got anything last to say on the MDBA or the Murray-Darling Basin? Jump in. Final comments on that subject?
We could talk literally for days and still not get to the bottom of it. My head is spinning. I've been deeply back into this research for a few months now, and I'm scrambling to keep up. And someone like Ron has decades of knowledge that simply can't be conveyed in such a short period of time. I think we've covered it reasonably well, but what I want to stress is the urgency of bringing some kind of relief to our irrigators. As Ron has said, if there isn't rain and there isn't a change in heart, and we start to see some of this so-called environmental water being put back on the market and being made available to irrigators, literally in the next few months. I mean, there are irrigators, particularly in the dairy industry, which is the one that I happen to know more about, although I'm sure it's being played out in every area of irrigation. There are farms and farmers walking off the land every week. There are farmers taking their own lives every week. And every week that we allow this to continue, we lose more good people. This isn't just a case of numbers. This is a case of decades of expertise that we are losing off the land. It can't be replaced by a corporate farm buying and taking over the same bit of land. It doesn't work out the same way. We are losing decades worth of knowledge that simply cannot be replaced except by people growing up on a farm and learning it from their childhood and understanding their land. This is more important than the economic damage. It's more important than any of the monetary aspects of this issue. The brain drain and the human cost of all of these people leaving the land is unspeakable. It's incalculable. And if we don't see some kind of a change in literally the next few months, then my concern is that most of the communities that are losing members progressively will have gone past that point of collapse. And we will be left with very few small towns, and very little of the infrastructure that the remaining farms depend on will actually be there for them. And we will have a genuine system-wide collapse, not an ecological collapse, but a collapse of the entire community, or certainly communities across the basin. So there is a real urgency. We have to find a solution that is going to bring some relief to irrigators literally within the next few months.
Ron, final comments on the MDBA?
Just adding to that, if we do not overturn the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and as well as that, correct our production of electricity within the next 3 months, the government will be destroyed, the Australian economy will be destroyed, and we will take decades to recover. It is that serious, and we're going to run out of electricity before Christmas. Barring something unforeseen. And if you think that running out of water's bad, wait until you've run out of water and electricity.
Can you expand on that? The snowy hydro crisis. Can you just... That's the next thing on the agenda.
Look, snowy hydro, it's the biggest, greediest, most incompetent monopoly that's ever been set up in Australia. For Morrison and Taylor to stand up there and say, we are going to force the producers of electricity to lower the price of power, is the most blatant hypocrisy I've ever heard in politics. Who owns snowy hydro? The Commonwealth Government. Which producer is the only producer that can produce power at the flick of a switch in sufficient quantity to make the difference between keeping the lights on and having them go off. It's snowy hydro. The greatest profiteer in the electricity market is snowy hydro. That's why Turnbull wanted to do snowy too. He wanted to increase that. Now, they have been so flagrantly using water to produce power just to keep the lights on, because our so-called renewable power industry is, it might be renewable, but it doesn't produce much power. We are now down to only 1 million megalitres of storage left in the Snowy. When it's full, it's over 5 million megalitres. The Snowy scheme is supposed to deliver over 1 million megalitres a year to the Murrumbidgee on the one hand and the Murray on the other. In other words, 2.1 million megalitres a year. There's only 1 million megalitres left in the whole system. That means there's going to be no water for irrigation on top of what we said, and the downstream dams are nearly empty. That's why there's no allocations of water. But it's also why, if this drought moves south, and at the moment the Murray system isn't in drought, they're having a pretty good season, and you probably saw the big snowfalls we've had in the last 2 or 3 days. But if it runs dry from now till Christmas, guess what? There'll be no water left in Snowy Hydro, and the lights will go out in Sydney and Melbourne. The only way they can prevent the lights going out if Snowy runs below 10% is to start up one of the coal-fired power stations in your lawn again. It's the only way they can stop it.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, we've got a serious problem. Power is not something that I've invested a lot of time researching at this stage, so I'm going to keep my comments pretty restricted just because I don't feel I'm qualified to go beyond this. But the power consumption of the desalination plant was one of the reasons why I felt it was just a dumb idea in the first place. Even 10 years ago, it was already becoming obvious that we were heading towards a power crunch. In the same way that we haven't built any new dams since the 1970s, well, we really haven't built any meaningful power stations since around about the same time. I mean, yes, we've built a bunch of windmills, we've built a bunch of solar. They have some pretty serious limitations that are not yet able to be dealt with properly. I mean, in time, perhaps energy storage will reach the point where we can buffer those sources and we can feed them into the grid, and it might all become economically viable at some point in the future, but we are quite a long way away from that right now. The only saving grace and the only source of hope right now, and it's tragic that it's come to this, is the fact that as I sit here in the southeast of Melbourne, the last 2 weeks have just been bucketing rain, and that rain has extended well into the south east of Victoria and into the very southeast of New South Wales as well. So my hope is that the combination of rainfall and snowfall that we are getting these last few weeks is going to get us out of dodge, but it's going to be a very close scrape. And the idea that with all of this infrastructure that we've created literally over 100 years, we have put ourselves in a position where we have to get lucky just to keep the lights on and just to keep water flowing down our rivers is madness. How incompetent do we have to be to get into this situation? It's insane.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, it's a systems crisis as opposed to, weather crisis or something else like that.
Yeah.
Ron, you also wanted to just mention quickly the revised Bradfield scheme, which you worked on with the Queensland Water Authority, whatever that administration was called. What is the revised Bradfield scheme? Why have you got why is it so popular?
The revised Bradfield, or going back a step, the group I work with mostly is the Australian Water Exploration Company. They're a not-for-profit company. They have spent the last 12 years researching every possible water conservation project in Australia. We presented to the federal and the New South Wales state governments a full plan for all the water conservation measures we need to keep Australia in water and power, by the way, for the next 100 years, 4 years ago. Barnaby Joyce threw it off the table and said, we couldn't do that. What would the Greens say? So that's just by way of a little bit of background. But the Bradfield scheme, as it was originally proposed, was to send water mostly from the Burdekin Valley down the western rivers and into Lake Eyre. And of course, that was only really wasting water. we devised a plan where we would take the same water from the same rivers, but put it on the vast and very fertile plains of central Western Queensland. Some of the most fertile land in the world is there, but it's very, very dry. And the great thing about it is it's not really subtropical or tropical. It's still a Mediterranean climate out there. And all of our major food crops are grown in a Mediterranean climate. So we can create a second food bowl there. I've been pushing for that now for, crikey, 15 years, 20 years. But there's a very, very big but. We must not lift one finger to build a second food bowl while ever we're destroying the one we got. We've got to fix that one first, which goes right back to where this whole discussion started. So I just want to make that absolutely plain. And but we can, as long as we fix the Murray-Darling Basin first, we can create a second huge food bowl in central Western Queensland.
There is an opportunity there as well to bring some water into the top end of the Darling, not necessarily from those rivers, but there are some rivers a bit further south that still get some tropical rainfall and have decent and fairly consistent annual runoff. The Darling River itself, to me, is the key to the entire Murray-Darling Basin, in addition to fixing the lower lakes so that the water that's evaporating off there can be used productively elsewhere. The Darling River itself is vital, and you may be hearing really conflicted things about the river system right now. For example, the Darling River is dry, but the Murray River is too full. Why in the world is that happening? How does that make sense? To the casual observer, it doesn't. To someone who knows the system, it makes perfect sense. We are obliged, when I say we, the upstream states, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, are obliged to ensure that there's a certain amount of water flowing across the South Australian border every day that then meets their needs for keeping the lower lakes fresh, as well as their own irrigation, industrial and consumptive water use for drinking and so forth. So that is a minimum amount of water that we have to keep flowing across the border, which is the Murray as it crosses the border. In addition to that, just recently, because irrigation water was decoupled from land titles, a whole bunch of enterprising, generally multinational companies bought up very cheap land in the Riverina, bought up water and said, right, now you're going to deliver that water to us down here, and they're growing nuts and things a long way downstream in the river. There are two things that you have to work with in a gravity-fed irrigation system. One is litres, the litres of water, and the other is meters, the meters of elevation. Those are the two things that you have. And as you have to send water further and further downstream, it has to stay in the river for a longer period of time and over a greater journey. If you're releasing water from the Hume Dam and delivering it to the South Australian border, it has to make its way through the Barmah and the Gunbower chokes, or the Mallewa Gunbower forest, in order for it to actually arrive at its destination. Now, that destination is downstream of where the Darling River meets the Murray. So really, that water need is supposed to be being met by the Murray River supplying about 70% of that water need, and the Darling River supplying about 30% of that water need. The problem is the Darling is providing zero. That means the Murray River has to provide 100% of all of that demand, that growing demand, because there's so many irrigators now moving down that way and buying water and saying, hey, we want it delivered all the way down here. That water doesn't fit in the river, the amount of water that we're currently trying to send down. And so they're having to reflood the Barmah forest over and over again to get water through various other ways to try and meet that demand. And that's causing the banks, the erosion that we're seeing in both the Goulburn River as well as in the Murray River and elsewhere. It's causing a lot of the native trees in the Barmah forest are stressed or dead because they've simply been flooded every year for the last 5 years, and Australian trees do not cope with that. They want to be flooded at most once every 3 to 5 years, which is what used to happen with the Gunbower. And now, I think it was last year, they had it underwater for 140 days straight. That's not how our trees have.
They'd be all dead if that's the case.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of trees. There's a huge amount of. I know someone who does regular resurveys of the tree canopy, and there are a lot of dead trees down there. And this is because they're trying to deliver all this water downstream without the use of the Darling. If we got more water into the Darling to begin with, and that would require some creative thinking and some political courage that I think we lack at the moment, and the Darling once again became that more reliable river that Ron alluded to, where it was actually much more reliably providing water for about 30 years before we screwed it up again, then that would actually fix a lot of the other problems throughout the system, simply because of how important that is.
Can I just suggest go online and have a look at the plan that works for all. it covers all of that. And at the same time, Google the Darling River fix. Correctly managed, we should actually have virtually no water going past Wentworth out of the Darling River. There is absolutely no need for any water out of the Darling to look after the lower end of the Murray. But
Interesting. Okay.
also understand that the only way, well, not the only way, but one of the major things we have to do to manage all of the waters in the Murray-Darling Basin on a everlasting, for want of a better phrase, way, we still have to build Chowilla Dam down towards the end of the Murray. And the reason for that are very simple. The only dam on the Murray is Hume Dam. There's no other dams. There's dams on some of the tributaries, but the only one's Hume Dam. And it's only 3 million megalitres. In Australian terms, that's a fairly big dam, but it's not really all that much water. The Kiwar, the Ovens, the King, the Goulburn, the Campaspe, the Loddon and the Avoca rivers all run into the Murray below Hume Dam from Victoria. On the northern side, you've got the Billabong Creek, the Murrumbidgee, the Lachlan and the Darling all flow into the Murray below Hume Dam. Why do you think we constantly have these major flushes of water down the bottom end of the Murray? It's because all of those rivers, some of them have got dams on them, but when you get a wet year, the amount of catchment you've got below the dams, now, that's where we have to build Chowilla. We have to do what you say. We've got to turn the lakes back into an estuarine environment, so there's no fresh water wasted there. But we have to store a very large amount of fresh water, which would make sure that South Australia would never, ever be short of water again. In fact, they'd have 5, 6, 7 times more water than they've got now. But have a look at that document, and I know the other thing was we presented to the government a plan to do with the Upper Clarence, which is the biggest catchment on the east coast of Australia. That would put 1.2 million megalitres of extra water into the Darling every year.
Is there a name of the document that I should search for that?
I'll email it to you. And bear in mind when you get it, the government's had it. The Australian Water Exploration Company put it to both the New South Wales and the federal government. It's something that should go forward 4 or 5 years ago. But once again, nobody's lifted a finger.
So my question, I guess, at the end is, as we sort of run out of time on this issue, these are quite big issues. These are, we're talking about gigaliters of water. We're talking about huge river systems. We're talking about ecological systems, human systems, communities. And I guess the question for the average person is, wow, this sounds really big. And this, I know the MDBA is the source of the problem, but what can I do? How can I help? What can I do? And I know, for example, there's plenty of people protesting about climate change. I don't think these people are really concerned about what we're talking about. But what can people do who are actually concerned and want to make an impact, and they know they have a limited time? I don't know who wants to lead on this issue, but how can we help as a community, as Australians, as average people?
I've got a bit to say on that. I'm working through a 3-stage plan of how I want to contribute to this issue, and I emphasise contribute because I'm not a central player in this. I'm just another person who's lending my shoulder to the workload. But a part of that plan involves a well-timed email campaign that will go out to MPs that will coincide with a mass media campaign that is currently coming together, and we've seen the beginnings of that already. The MDBA, viewers and listeners may have noticed that it started to pop up in newspaper and on radio and things where they haven't really heard of it before. It suddenly shows up in Four Corners and it shows up in a current affair. That wasn't happening 2 months ago. That doesn't happen by accident. So the beginnings of that is starting to become visible. That is going to culminate in the next month as the Victorian Parliament and then the Federal Parliament convenes. There are going to be some things said in Parliament House that are going to, and on the record in Hansard, that are going to be significant. I'm then going to need as many people as possible to then take the content that I will supply them with, a mixture of the mainstream media as well as some of these extracts from Hansard, which I will then formulate into an email your MP campaign. And I need as many people as possible to then bombard their MPs with that email to say, hey, we're paying attention to this issue. This is an issue that is going to swing votes. So if someone wants to make a difference, right now I don't have anything for you to do, but if you could jump on my Facebook page, facebook.com/Topher Field, just like the page, comment on some things so that if Facebook ranks what it shows you based on what you've interacted with. So interact with a few of the posts, and then you'll start to see my content come through. And then come around about the end of August, that's when I'm going to need some serious people power. And the more people that are on that page, the more people we can mobilize and the bigger an impact we can have.
How about you, Ron? How do we help?
Well, the first thing, Christopher, is thanks very much. I'm saying that as an old irrigator, for want of a better phrase. And I agree, we've got to do something, but the real problem we've got, the people that are hurting the most have been hurting now for several years. And most of them have lost hope. I won't mention a name here, but a very, very well-known lady who's part of a big farming family enterprise who has been driving this agenda for nearly the same time as I have, about 12 years. She rang me the other day, in fact it was last Sunday, and she just said, Ron, I haven't got any fight left. I can't do any more. And she said, we're going to have to walk off and leave everything that, several generations have built up. She said, we can't last past Christmas. So how does it get bad enough that the government wakes up? I don't know, but personally and through my political contacts, I'll certainly be pushing it very, very hard. But no, it's a desperate situation at the moment. It is desperate, and I don't know how we change it. But what I do know is, and I'll go on the record and say this, we have in Canberra and Macquarie Street some of the most incompetent politicians I have seen, and I've been in the political field for well over 50 years. Frankly, they are a bloody disgrace, and I tried to get rid of some of them at the last election. We got rid of a few, but not but a lot of them are still there. And they are self-serving, they are self-centred, and we have created, and like the Murray-Darling Basin Authority is part of this, we've created a governing class to whom it doesn't matter if we go into a recession, it doesn't matter if we don't produce our own food, it doesn't matter if we run out of power, because they have sinecures for life. And that makes me sick.
Yeah, let me just add to that. The only way that this is going to change is if politicians start to realise that votes depend on this. If their little comfortable patch starts to be threatened by this issue, because I completely agree with you, Ron. And it's only by making them feel that they have something personally to lose, because unfortunately the argument about the pain being felt by other people certainly doesn't seem to have the effect that it should. I'm not going to say they don't care at all, but they and even listening to politicians going on to various talk shows in the last 2 weeks where I know that they know what's going on, and I listen to what they say, whether it's on radio or television, and I'm not going to name names, but it's people from all the major parties, and they get on there and they talk about, this was a bipartisan effort, the states have agreed, they talk about how united all the political class are, that this is the right thing to do, and they brush aside any objections from the interviewer about the impact in the real world. There really is this kind of class, this bubble that they've created for themselves, and until that's threatened, then nothing will change. And this is where, in my view, people power is incredibly important, because whether they like it or not, and trust me, politicians don't like it, they do have to answer to the polls every 3 or 4 years, depending on state and federal and where you are. And they do depend on getting those numbers. And if this becomes one of those issues that they know is going to swing votes, then, well, the minor parties are already getting behind us. We've had calls for a royal commission to this from every minor party, with the exception of Jackie Lambie, and that's simply because we haven't had enough time to actually find out where she stands. I'm not saying she doesn't agree with it, I just don't know where she stands. But every other minor party senator in the Australian Parliament is joining the call for a royal commission. No one from Labor, Liberals or Nationals is joining that call, because they're the ones responsible for the problem. And until they feel that their comfortable position, their bipartisan little happy club is threatened because people are so angry in insufficient numbers, until that happens, nothing's going to change. And that's where I'll say it again. And yes, it's self-promotion, but I'll say it again. Facebook.com/Topher Field. Find that page, get on that page, because I am working on trying to break through that bubble, but I can't do it without literally thousands of other people helping me to do that.
No, well, you'll certainly have my support. And there are politicians there at the moment that are aware of the problem and are sympathetic to our cause. And I'm meeting with a couple of those next week. But we don't want to go into this here, but I just want to say, calling a royal commission as far as the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is concerned is, in my opinion, just an absolute waste of time.
It's a tactic. I'm not going to go into the details. It is a tactic. It is not an end in itself.
There's already been 4 inquiries, including one royal commission. Mm-hmm. Nothing's changed. Mm-hmm. Who sets the terms of reference? The government and the bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. Who chooses the commissioner? The government and the bureaucracy. They know what the outcome of the royal commission is going to be before we even start. And you've got to remember, you've got a workforce of 400 plus so-called experts sitting there, Murray-Darling Authority, up against, a few farmers' organisations and so on. Who's going to win that fight?
All I'll say, Ron, is that I and the people that I'm working on this campaign with are extremely aware of all of that. Yet there is still a reason why we're calling for a royal commission. So I'm not going to give our particular game away, but just hang in there with me. The PR side of things is my jam, and there is a reason we're going for that.
Additional pressure. I like it.
Maybe.
Okay.
All right. Well, that's kind of brings us to the end of the show. I don't want to hold you hostage forever. Although that would be fun because we could just keep talking.
Fun.
Yeah. As I said, Fraser left a statement. He's totally behind it. Well, at least the Bradfield scheme, as he said in his statement. He's well aware of this. I know that some of Pauline's people are behind it. I know, there's a lot of sort of right leaning. I'm not so sure about the left though, because this is what I mean about the protest. We're seeing a lot of environmental protests in the cities from city people right now as we speak. You go out and they're taping themselves to the roads, but they're not really bringing up the Murray-Darling. They're just saying generic statements about save the world. So I wonder if that's an education factor, or if this is they're based on globalist thinking and not local thinking.
But that's exactly what happened just recently with Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. She spent a day with someone who I won't name, but she, to her credit, is actually trying to learn about these things. And she spent an entire day with someone who was coming from the farming side of the argument. And that's where, having spent that day with them and having learned about it from their point of view, she came out and said, well, this isn't farmers versus the environment. And I think that's a real credit to her. And hopefully that leadership from her will permeate the rest of the Greens, and they'll begin to realise that this isn't a zero-sum game where we have to take from one to give to the other. So I have some hope that we can bring a percentage of left-leaning and environmentally minded people over. There is no doubt that there is an enormous amount of environmental damage being done, and if they genuinely care about the environment, and I believe they do, then this is an issue that they will start to pay attention to, and I think we're beginning to see that already. In addition to One Nation and Fraser running, shooters, fishers and farmers have been excellent on this. They took a lot of ground off the Nationals in the New South Wales state election, and I think that's a bit of a warning shot. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and I know that their strategy moving forward involves this issue. The Liberal Democrats in Victoria are very much on side and are making public statements to that effect, as are other people coming on board. And we're seeing, I think, a real groundswell of everyone except for the majors. And the question that is going to have to be asked very, very soon is, what do the majors have to hide? Why are they refusing to join the calls for a royal commission? Why are they stonewalling Mick Keelty in his efforts to uncover corruption and conflicts of interest and insider trading? Why are they not cooperating with any of these things? As we get told all the time, as the surveillance state increases and all of that happens, we get told, well, if you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear, right? What do the major parties have to hide? Because they're not allowing us to actually see what they've done.
Any last comments, Ron?
No, that's fine.
All right, Topher Field.
I think we've covered everything that really matters.
Yeah. Topher Field and Ron Pike, thank you very much for coming on Det Nation, the Unshackled.net. Get on there. Look, this has been a fantastic opportunity to learn a lot about the Murray-Darling, learn about the corruption, the MDBA, the issues, how we've ruined our water capacity, even though, as Ron pointed out, we have an ample supply of water in this country, both above ground and underground with the Great Artesian Basin as well. So there's been mismanagement, and we know some of the problems, and we know some of the source areas. So let's go after them. Let's get organized. Let's rally. Thank you, Topher Field. Thank you, Ron. And look, you're welcome back on the show anytime you want. If you have things to update us about, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Det Nation.